Picture a high wooden room, ringed with steep tiers of railings, and every railing crowded with young men leaning forward to get a better look. There is sawdust scattered across the floorboards, thrown down fresh that morning, to soak up whatever the day is going to bring. And in the middle of it all, under a tall window for the light, there is a plain wooden table. On that table there is a man. He is awake. That is the part I need you to hold on to. He is entirely, helplessly awake. There is a strip of leather for him to bite down on, and there are several strong men standing close, and their only job is to hold him still, because in about a minute, a surgeon is going to take this man's leg off at the thigh. And there is nothing to send him to sleep, no anesthetic of any kind. Nothing has been invented yet that could. The surgeon rolls his sleeves back over a dark coat that is stiff and shining with the dried blood of every operation he has ever done, because it does not yet occur to a single soul in that room that the coat should ever be washed. He does not scrub his hands. He picks up a long, thin knife. He glances just once at the clock on the wall. And the only kindness, the only mercy in the whole world that this man can offer the patient on that table is to be quick, to be fast, to be, if he can possibly manage it, the fastest knife in London. That was surgery once, not in some dark and forgotten century, within a lifetime of the electric light. And the man holding the knife was, by the standards of that terrible trade, quite simply the best there was. My name is Dr. Hollis. For the better part of 40 years I worked as a pathologist and a coroner, which is a genteel way of saying that people tended to come to me after medicine had finished with them, one way or another. I have spent a good deal more of my life in the company of the dead than the living, and I stopped being frightened by very much a long time ago. You develop a certain humor in my line of work. You rather have to. But every so often I read something in the old case books that stops me cold, even now. And the world I have just put in front of you, surgery before anesthesia, is the one that does it to me every single time. So pour yourself something and settle in, and let me tell you about a man named Robert Liston, the fastest knife in the West End, the finest surgeon of his age, and how the very thing that made him a hero is the thing that would give you nightmares. Robert Liston was a Scot, born in 1794, a minister's son, tall and strong and famously sure of himself. He made his name in Edinburgh and then came south to London, where he became a professor of surgery at University College Hospital in the 1830s. And this was the London of the early Victorians, gaslight and horse dung and cholera in the water, a London that had steam trains and grand ideas and absolutely no notion, none whatsoever, of what actually caused a wound to fester. Keep that in your pocket. We will come back to it, and it is the whole tragedy of the age. Liston operated in what they very honestly called an operating theater. And I do mean theater in every sense. It was a performance with an audience. There were the tiered galleries I described, packed with medical students and curious gentlemen, all paying to watch, all leaning in over the rails. There was a table and there was sawdust, and there was, more often than not, a bucket. And the star of the show, the surgeon, would sweep in and address the crowd, and then turn to the terrified patient and, by long tradition, say 5 words that have echoed down through medicine ever since. Time me, gentlemen, time me, and spare a thought, if you will, for the patient underneath all this pageantry. Think what it was to be that person. You have known for days that this is coming. You have climbed the stairs to a room you can hear from the corridor. You are laid down on a table that others have been laid down on before you, in front of a crowd of strangers who have come to watch, and you are given a strip of leather or a twist of cloth to bite, and told, essentially, to be brave and to be still. There is no premedication to calm you, no curtain to hide behind, no dignity of any kind on offer. There is only the waiting and the crowd and the surgeon reaching for his knife. I have read a great many things in my career that I would rather forget, and the plain, ordinary courage it must have taken simply to lie down on that table is high on the list. Because that was the whole game. Speed was not showing off, although, with Liston, I will admit there was a good deal of showing off. Speed was the mercy. Speed was the only anaesthetic they had. Let me make you feel why, because if you do not understand this one thing, the rest of it just sounds like cruelty, and it was not cruelty. It was the opposite. It was the best they could do with what they had. When you cut into a living, conscious human being, three things are trying to kill that person in front of you all at once from the very first stroke. The first is the sheer shock of it. The body, overwhelmed by pain and terror, can simply shut down and stop, there on the table. The second is blood loss, which climbs with every second the wound is open. And the third, the one that came later and quieter, was infection, which I will get to. But shock and blood loss are creatures of time. Every extra second the patient spends screaming and open on that table is another second for them to bleed, and another second for the body to give up the fight. So the faster the surgeon, the fewer seconds of agony, the less blood spilled, the better the odds. A slow, careful, gentle surgeon in 1835 was not being kind. A slow surgeon was, quite literally, killing you. The kind surgeon, the merciful one, was the one who could get in, take the leg, and be tying off the arteries before you had finished drawing breath to scream. In a world with no way to put you to sleep, the clock was the only painkiller anyone had, and Robert Liston was the fastest hand that clock ever measured. How fast? Well, here honesty compels me to slow down, which Liston never did. The stories say he could take a leg off in under 30 seconds. Some accounts stretch it to a couple of minutes for the whole business. And the truth is that these numbers grew in the telling, the way such numbers always do, so I will not swear to you it was exactly 28 seconds by a stopwatch. But everyone who actually watched the man agreed on the thing that mattered. He was astonishingly, almost unnaturally quick, and he was good. They said he was so fast that his knife was flashing back into its sheath before the students in the gallery had quite understood the operation had begun. They said, and I love this detail, though I would not stake my pension on it, that he worked so quickly he would clamp the bloody knife between his teeth to keep both hands free for the next task. He was a big man, immensely strong, and he needed to be, because in that era the surgeon also had to be the one holding the patient down. He designed his own instruments. There is a bone-cutting forceps that still carries his name, and a long amputation knife they called simply the Liston knife. He was, in short, the specialist you prayed for. If you had to have your leg off in the 1840s and awake, Robert Liston was the man you wanted holding the blade, because he gave you the one thing that improved your odds. He was fast, and he was finished before the slower men had properly started. But now we come to the part that turns the stomach, and it is not the blood, and it is not the speed. It is what nobody in that room knew. Remember the coat, the dark surgical coat, stiff and glossy with old dried blood. A surgeon wore that coat with pride. The stiffer and blacker and fouler it was, the more operations it represented, and so the more experienced and distinguished its owner. A crust of old gore was a badge of seniority. Surgeons did not wash their hands before operating, and they certainly did not wash them between one patient and the next. They wiped the knife on the coat or on a bit of cloth and moved along to the following case. The same unwashed hands, the same unwashed blade, the same coat all day. They were not monsters. They were not lazy. They simply did not know. The idea that there might be invisible living things, germs, passing from a dead body, or a sick body, or a filthy coat into an open wound, and they're quietly breeding into a lethal infection. That idea had not arrived yet. Joseph Lister, the surgeon who would finally work it out and give us antiseptic surgery, was in the 1840s still a young student. His revolution was more than 20 years away. So in Liston's theater, the operation might be a triumph, swift, skillful, the patient carried out alive and grateful, and then 3 or 4 days later the wound would turn hot and swollen and wrong, and the fever would come, and that same patient would die anyway. Not of the surgery, of the surgeon's hands, of the room, of the coat. They even had names for it. The infections that swept the surgical wards, hospital gangrene, pyemia. The fevers that killed a shocking share of everyone who was cut. In some hospitals, in some years, getting an amputation was very nearly a coin toss with death, and a fair number of the deaths came days after the knife, in a bed, from an enemy no one could see. That is the true horror of surgery before the germ was understood. The knife you could at least be quick with. The infection you could not fight at all because you did not know it was there. I had, years ago, a young assistant, Toby, his name was, who fainted the first time he watched me open a chest, and went a delicate shade of green at every autopsy for a month after. A thoroughly decent lad, simply not built for it. And I used to think of Toby whenever I read about those old operating theaters, because at least Toby had the luxury of squeamishness in a clean room, with gloves and soap, and the settled knowledge of what causes a wound to rot. The students in Liston's gallery had none of that comfort and did not know they lacked it. And I think, too, of the head nurse I trained under, a formidable woman who had, by her own account, seen absolutely everything, and who used to say that the worst thing in any hospital is never the thing you can see coming. She would have understood that theater completely. The danger in that room was not the screaming or the saw. It was the silence afterwards and the fever 3 days on. Now, I have kept you waiting for it, and here it is. The single most famous story ever told about Robert Liston. The reason, if I am honest, that most people who know his name at all know it. It is the tale of the operation with a 300% mortality rate, and I am going to tell it to you exactly as it comes down to us. And then I am going to be honest with you about it, because honesty is the whole point of what I do. The story goes like this. Liston is amputating a leg at his usual tremendous speed in front of the packed gallery. He works so fast and swings the knife so freely that he accidentally slices through the fingers of his young assistant, who is holding the patient. In the same terrible arc, the blade slashes through the coat of a distinguished spectator standing too close to the table, a surgeon or a gentleman come to watch, who feels the knife pass, is certain he has been fatally stabbed, and drops dead on the spot from sheer fright. The patient, meanwhile, survives the operation itself, but the wound and the assistant's wound both turned septic in the days after, and both men die of the infection. So, the patient dead, the assistant dead, and a spectator who was never touched by the knife at all dead of terror. 1 operation, 3 deaths, 300% mortality, a record of a sort that has never been troubled since. It is a magnificent story. It is grim and absurd, and it has everything. And I have to tell you, as a man whose entire trade is the difference between what is said to have happened and what actually happened, that there is almost certainly not a word of truth in it. The 300% tale can be traced more or less to a single book, a witty collection called Great Medical Disasters, written by the anesthetist and author Richard Gordon, and published in 1983, well over a century after Liston died. There is no contemporary record of it, no report from the day, no note in a case book, no eyewitness. Historians who have gone looking for the primary source have come back empty-handed. It has all the fingerprints of a tall tale that grew, polished by retelling, until it was too good to check. So I will not sell it to you as fact, because it very likely never happened. Cutting off your assistant's fingers mid-amputation and frightening a bystander to death and losing all three. Medicine, ladies and gentlemen, do not try this, obviously. But I want you to notice something, and it is the interesting part. The reason that story stuck to Robert Liston, of all the surgeons of his day, is that it was just barely believable of him. It grew up around him precisely because he was the fast one, the daring one, the showman with the flashing blade. Nobody ever invented a wild legend about the slow, cautious surgeon in the next theater. The myth is nonsense, but it is nonsense that could only have attached itself to the fastest knife in London. And that tells you something true even though the story is false. Because here is what the real record shows once you clear away the legend. Liston was not a reckless butcher, quite the reverse. For his era, his results were unusually good. He kept careful account of his cases, and by the brutal arithmetic of the time, when a quarter or more of amputees might not survive the aftermath, Liston lost fewer of his patients than most. His speed was not carelessness. It was a discipline in the service of mercy, in a world that offered him no other tool. He was, by the honest measure, one of the safest pairs of hands you could have fallen into, in a time when no pair of hands was safe. And I find that more haunting than the silly 300% story ever was, because it means the screaming and the leather strap and the 4 men holding you down and the race against the clock, all of that was the good version. That was excellent care. That was the best medicine on earth doing its absolute finest for you. Sit with that for a moment the next time you complain about a waiting room. So that was surgery in the autumn of 1846. Fast, brutal, skillful, agonizing, and utterly resigned to the fact that pain was simply the price of the cure. Every surgeon alive had made his peace with the screaming, because there was no alternative, and there never had been, in all the thousands of years that human beings had been cutting one another open to heal. Pain and surgery were the same word. To operate was to hurt. Everybody knew that the way they knew the sun came up. And then, in the space of a single winter, it stopped being true. The miracle did not come from a great London hospital or a famous professor. It came from a dentist in Boston, in America, on the 16th of October, 1846, in the surgical amphitheater of the Massachusetts General Hospital, a room they still keep to this day, and call the Ether Dome. A man named William Morton administered a dose of inhaled ether to a patient before an operation, and the patient felt nothing. A surgeon cut into him, and he did not scream, and he did not struggle, and he woke afterwards and said he had felt no pain at all. Try, for a moment, to grasp how enormous that is. For the whole of human history up to that October morning, to be operated on was to suffer everything, awake. And then one day in one room that stopped being the law of the universe. It is one of the few genuine miracles in the whole story of medicine, and unlike most of what I deal with, it is entirely true and it has a date. The 16th of October, 1846. Remember it. It is the day pain became optional. Now, in 1846, the news did not travel in an instant. It came the only way it could, by ship, across the Atlantic, carried in letters and reports, taking weeks. But it came, and it reached London, and it reached the ear of Robert Liston. And on the 21st of December, 1846, barely 2 months after Boston, and in that very same operating theater at University College Hospital, where he had raced the clock 1,000 times, Liston prepared to do something no surgeon in Britain had ever done. He was going to amputate a leg, above the knee, and his patient, a man named Frederick Churchill, some of the accounts have him as a butler, others a footman, was first going to be sent to sleep with ether. Imagine that room. The same tiered gallery packed as always, the same table, the same fast, famous, formidable surgeon. But this time the patient breathes the vapor and drifts away, gone, peaceful, and the theater that had heard so many years of screaming falls into a silence it had never known. Liston operates. The leg comes off in his usual handful of seconds, and the man on the table does not make a sound, does not fight, feels nothing. And when it is done, and the patient stirs and asks, as they often did, when the surgeon was going to begin, only to be told it was already over, you can only imagine what went through the minds of the men leaning on those rails. They had just watched the oldest rule in medicine break. History likes to hand Liston a triumphant line for that moment. The story goes that he turned to the students and declared, "This Yankee Dodge, gentlemen, beats mesmerism hollow, mesmerism being the fashionable hypnotism some had hoped might dull the pain, and never quite did. It is a wonderful line, and it may well be roughly what he said. But I owe you the truth, and the truth is that the men who were actually in the room remembered it differently. Several of them said that Liston, the great showman, was for once so struck, so genuinely stunned by what he had just seen, that he barely spoke at all. And do you know, I find that far more moving than any clever quip. The fastest knife in the West End, the man who raced the clock because agony left him no choice, standing there in silence, realizing that the race was over, that it need never be run again. There is a lovely footnote to that December day, and I will give it to you with the same warning I give everything. It is often told, and it is probably true, but I would not swear to every detail. It is said that among the students crowded into the gallery that morning, watching the first painless operation in Britain, was a serious young man named Joseph Lister, the very same Lister who, 20 years later, would work out that unseen germs were killing the patients who had survived the knife, and would give surgery its second great gift: cleanliness, antisepsis, the washed hands and the carbolic, and the end of the proud, filthy coat. And if that story is true, then in one small room on one winter morning sat both halves of the miracle that would turn butchery into surgery. The man who had just conquered the pain, and the boy who would go on to conquer the infection. Anesthesia and antisepsis. Take away the agony and take away the fever 3 days later, and you have, very nearly, modern surgery. It took both. Liston delivered the first. Lister, in time, delivered the second. Robert Liston did not live to see the rest of it. He died only a little over a year after that December morning in 1847, still a relatively young man, still at the height of his fame. He got to stand at the very hinge of the whole history of surgery, the last of the great racing knives, and the first surgeon in his country to make the race unnecessary. And then he was gone, before the new world he had opened had really begun. He never saw Lister's clean wards. He never saw the day when a patient could expect, as you and I expect, to go to sleep, be operated on, and simply wake up, whole and unharmed and unafraid. He opened the door and did not get to walk very far through it. So, Here is the part I really wanted you to carry away, and it is not really about Liston at all. It is about the men and women on that table. It is terribly easy to hear a story like this and feel a comfortable little shiver of superiority. How barbaric, we think. How primitive. Thank heaven we are not like that. But look again at the man strapped to that table at the very start, biting down on his strip of leather. He was not a primitive. He was not a fool. He was a person exactly as real as you are, with a family and a favorite meal, and a dread of that room every bit as sharp as yours would be. The only thing that separates you from him, the only thing is that you were born on the far side of a date. The 16th of October, 1846. He had the appalling luck to need a surgeon a few years too early, and you have the extraordinary luck to need one a little too late to ever feel what he felt. That is the whole of the difference. Not wisdom, not courage, timing. And that ought to do two things to you, I think. It ought to make you a great deal more grateful than you probably were this morning. Because the painless, sterile, dull little operations we now take entirely for granted are, by the measure of all human history, an outrageous and very recent miracle, paid for by everyone who screamed on a wooden table so that we would not have to. But it ought to do something harder, too. It ought to make you wonder what we are doing right now today in complete good faith, with the very best knowledge we have, that our own grandchildren will hear about and think, how could they, how did they not know, how did they bear it? Because Liston's surgeons were not wicked. They were us, doing their sincere best with what they had. And so are we, which is the question I would genuinely like to leave you with, down in the comments, because I do read them. What is the thing we do now, some ordinary treatment, some habit, some certainty we would never dream of questioning, that you suspect the doctors of 100 years from now will talk about the way I have just talked about Robert Liston's knife? I have my own private list. I would very much like to see yours. If you would like more of these, the cures that were worse than the disease, the well-meaning horrors, the strange dark corners of how we used to try to heal one another, then do consider subscribing, and I will keep telling them to you with as much respect for the people who suffered them as I can manage, and only the occasional bad joke. My name is Dr. Hollis. Be grateful for the date you were born on, and the next time you are lying in a bright, clean room, drifting off to sleep before some small operation you will not feel and will barely remember, spare a thought, just one, for the man on the wooden table, awake, listening to a surgeon say, "Time me, gentlemen. Until next time."